Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center of European Studies at the University of North Carolina's Friday Lecture Series. We are pleased to welcome back today Professor Herman Schwartz, Professor of Political Science at the University of Virginia. Professor Schwartz will be helping us to usher in our second theme in the lecture series this year, social policy in the age of austerity. Now, I was going to make some introductions regarding how prolific Professor Schwartz is, how widely published he is, how widely respected his texts are, but he doesn't feel this best represents the trajectory of his academic career. And so I will read to you Professor Schwartz's preferred introduction. Herman Schwartz received his early training at a Shaolin monastery, where he mastered cutting wit and endless patience with bureaucratic opponents. Hours of standing in icy water, followed by beatings, made department meetings, and decanal addresses a piece of rice cake. Schwartz is mostly known for his collection of 273 identical shirts made from paper repulped from unsold copies of his books. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Herman Schwartz.
Thanks, and you should hold the applause till the end, because maybe this will be awful. Thanks also to Evie and John for inviting me, and to Sarah and Erica and Stephanie for taking care of paperwork and things like that. So I was asked to talk about the connection between the American housing market and the housing bubble in 2008 and the Eurozone crisis, and that's what I'm going to do. And the connections actually are very immediate and real, but it's a little technical. So if I use technical terms in the talk, as I sometimes want to do, and you want to make a clarifying question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll take clarifying questions. But basically, this should be pretty easy to follow, because the basic logic of the talk is something you all know already, which is the classic fairy tale, The Three Little Pigs. And actually, many of you will have read this beautiful version or have had it read to you by your parents, since you're the right age to remember it. And if you do, this is the best version of The Three Little Pigs. So the story of the Eurozone crisis is a fairy tale. It's the story of the Three Little Pigs, except, of course, there's 5 pigs. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And the story is, of course, a story about straw houses falling down rather than brick houses, which are stable. But it's, of course, a story not just about the pigs who are living in these houses, but also about the wolves that came to the door. So the basic story here is that the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area. And just hold off on what that is for a second if you don't know. But the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area. It's a straw house, not a brick house. And what happened was that 2 wolves came to the door. And wolf number 1 was the US financial crisis in 07, 08, 09. And the second wolf was the emergence of huge imbalances inside Europe because of German choices about wage restraint and domestic consumption. And in the absence of these 2 wolves, there probably would have not been much of a problem. Pigs could have lived happily in the straw house that was the Eurozone, but the problem was that the wolves came along, and when the wolves came along, the houses fell down. So let's start with the optimal currency area thing. And this is the straw house bit. And the basic point here is that the Euro crisis is a balance of payments crisis. And for those of you who are old enough to have lived back in 19th century US, like Professor Stevens, you'll remember that there were these relatively large regional imbalances that would emerge inside the US. And this created a lot of regional tensions, and this is what gave rise to things like the free silver movement, because you'd have these periodic outflows of cash from rural US to urban US, which at that time meant from Midwest US to the East Coast. And this created enormous political tension. And what you see in Europe today is basically the same thing. There's enormous regional tensions because of imbalances across the regions. And the US in the 19th century had a single currency, just like Europe today has a single currency. And the problem with single currencies is that they remove an easy and important way to overcome regional imbalances, to overcome huge trade imbalances between regions. if you think about the normal model of the world in which you have a country that's exporting a lot and a country that's importing a lot, the importer runs a balance of payments deficit. If they have their own currency, one way to solve that balance of payments deficit is to devalue their currency, depreciate their currency. And when they do that, it makes the cost of importing more expensive. It makes exporting more attractive. In the world of the economists, which is actually not the world we live in today, but it sounds good when you tell the story. In the world of the economists, the result is more exports, fewer imports, and the trade balance goes away. So the price mechanism is an easy way to get rid of regional imbalances where the price is the price of your currency. But once you shift to having a single currency across different areas, you can't use that price mechanism anymore. So if you take that price mechanism away and you can't use changes in currency exchange rates to get rid of trade imbalances, what's left? Well, what's left is this list here. And this is a list of things that qualify you as an optimal currency area, which is to say an economic zone in which there's enough interactions to even out regional imbalances without having to resort to that price mechanism of exchange rates. And if you think about the American economy today as opposed to the 19th century US, you'll immediately recognize that we have something close to an optimal currency area. You can answer yes to all these questions, and I'm going to actually go through each one of them. But if you think about Europe, you can't answer yes to all of them. So if we say, is Europe an optimal currency area? The answer is, let's see, well, do they have open financial markets? They would like to say yes, but in actual fact, I would actually code that no. I put yes up there so that I can maybe be eligible for European Union money so that I don't offend them. But actually, I think it's really at best maybe. The reason I think it's at best maybe is one huge market is not liquid across the continent. They don't have a continental-wide securities market. And in particular, for mortgage-backed securities, these are not tradable across borders in any easy way. And then actually secondarily, public debt, it turns out, is not so liquid across borders. But let's just say it's yes, to give them some credit. Are there open goods markets? They would again say yes, and I again say maybe. Those of you who really are old enough, like my age or John's age or whatever, remember that on the TV when we were kids, they used to say prices slightly higher west of the Rockies. And that was because of transportation costs. They're not an issue today in the US economy, but in the European economy, transportation costs don't matter, but you still have barriers to trade in important things like cars, or if you're sitting in Denmark and you try to go to Amazon, you get automatically redirected to amazon.uk. If you're sitting in Germany, you get automatically redirected to amazon.de. So there are subtle barriers like this that prevent a free flow of goods. Is there high internal labor mobility? No. And here the contrast with the US is really strong. So let's just stop for a second and think about why you might have big regional imbalances, right? You could have huge trade imbalances. One area is importing a lot of goods. One area is exporting a lot of goods. Normally, and normally here means like in the US, you could have a flow of labor from one region to the other, and that would reduce demand in the net importer perhaps, or increase demand in the net exporter, because the net exporter would be maybe having higher rising wages. And in the US, and conversely, if you have an economic catastrophe and you have high levels of unemployment, labor mobility might even those levels of unemployment out. And in the US, we have roughly 2% mobility across state lines in any given year. It's slowed down a bit since the 2008 crisis, but take 2%. You might say 2%, that doesn't sound like a lot of labor mobility, but thought experiment. Two states with roughly similar populations, one has 8% unemployment, one has 4% unemployment. In 1 year, all other things being equal, in the US, that would balance itself out as 2% of the population moved from one place to the other. In Europe, labor mobility inside countries, for most European countries, is about 1%, so half the US level. Labor mobility across borders, up until the crisis, was 0.1%. It takes a lot of years to even out a 4 percentage point difference in unemployment rates with 0.1% labor mobility. The number's gone up a little bit since the crisis, but not that much. So you don't get an evening out of regional imbalances through labor mobility in Europe. And then also in terms of fiscal transfers, which is the last and in some ways the best way to even out regional imbalances if you don't have the price mechanism. Again, the contrast between the US and Europe are striking. So again, let's come back to the US for a second. We've had huge regional imbalances. We've, in the 20th century and in the last 30 or 40 years, we've had huge regional imbalances. We've had severely depressed areas. And the problem eventually goes away, and eventually is after a couple of years and without wrenching financial crises. If you think back to the first collapse of the automobile industry in the 1980s, newspapers were full of stories about black tag people in Texas. And what were black tag people? They were people with black Michigan license plates who'd moved to Texas, which was booming in the 1980s. And that's the labor mobility solving the problem. And likewise, in the 2008 crisis, we've had huge falls in housing values, huge increases in foreclosures in places like California, Florida, Arizona. But we didn't have a Florida banking crisis, and we didn't have a Florida public debt crisis because there were huge transfers of money by the state, by the federal state, to those states that were in trouble. And it's invisible. We had to pay no attention to it. And I'm not talking about the bailouts of banks, which were bailouts of national banks, which were very visible, but there was also a lot of invisible transfers. So let's think about them. Social Security. 5% of American GDP goes through the Social Security system every year. By and large, it transfers money from high income, high wage, high growth areas to low wage, low growth, low income areas because of the redistributive nature of Social Security. 5% of American GDP goes through Medicare, Medicaid every year. It also tends to be a net transfer to depressed areas, low wage areas. And then about 4% of GDP goes through the Defense Department, which for historic reasons tends to mean a lot of spending in what were once poor places and still to some extent are poor places, the American South mostly, but also Virginia, which is a rich state. And I thank the government every day when I get up in the morning that their spending keeps my institution alive and pays my salary. No, I don't. I forget most days, okay? So that's the US, right? 5% Social Security, 5% Medicare, 5% more or less, or 4% military spending. The EU budget only moves 2% of European Union GDP. Of that, half is going to agricultural payments, and of that, half is going to rich countries. So it's not a good mechanism for redistribution. If you get a collapse of economic activity like you had in Spain, there's not much that's going to help Spain out. If you think about this list, there's not big fiscal transfers, there's not enough labor mobility, right? And then goods markets. Financial markets actually turn out to be a problem. The financial markets mean money can flow out of Spain pretty easily, but not much comes in. So you can see why this is a straw house. And then finally, and also very important, there's not a common understanding of what the purpose of public policy is. We don't wake up in America every morning and say, or at least I don't, maybe you do, we don't say, those people in Florida, they're so lazy. They don't work hard. They just borrow money and spend it sitting around on the beach. And so I really don't feel like the Fed should be bailing out banks in Florida. We don't say that. What happens is I go to the bank, which I'm not going to make advertisements for because they're all a bunch of crooks and I don't really like my bank. But I go to the bank, I put my ATM card in, and it doesn't matter to me that that bank is solvent because of federal and FDIC transfers, Federal Reserve transfers and FDIC transfers to the branches they have in Florida. You don't wake up and think about that. You don't care about it. And actually, you don't wake up and think, oh yeah, Florida, the economy sucks. Arizona, the economy sucks, and my federal tax dollars are going to help people there. I really resent that. I don't wake up in the morning and think that. But Germans wake up in the morning and they think, oh, those lazy Greeks who work more hours than us, all they do is spend those working hours standing on the beach drinking Retsina while they collect EU transfer payments, and they expect me to bail them out because they don't really work hard. Right? They think that. There's not a common set of ideas. So if you think about Europe versus America, you can say, big problem with Europe is when you get these big regional imbalances, there's no mechanism to rectify them. So all it takes is a push on the straw house, the house falls down, and there's no way to put it back up, unlike the push on the brick house where it doesn't make much difference. I've spent a lot of hours leaning against the bricks on my house, it doesn't move. Okay? So when the wolf comes along, what you get is serious, serious problems. And the wolf came along. Okay, so what's the wolf? The wolf starts in America, and it starts a long time ago. It starts roughly here, right? 1970s. Although we usually, and we can have a fight about this. I mean, John, I think, has different ideas about this, but the wolf starts back here in the 1970s, not really with Reagan, which is the usual story. And the wolf is this growing disparity in America between productivity in the economy and income for average families. And that's this hole right here. It's this gap. And why is that a problem? The problem is wage growth is flat, but output continues to rise. How do you make demand and supply match? Well, if average incomes are not rising and productivity is rising, where's the money going? The money's going to the rich people, the top 1%. And the problem with being rich, they have a lot of problems, and they complain a lot. You read the New York Times, you hear constant complaints. The problem with being rich is it's really hard to spend the money. It's really hard to spend the money. If you have $1 billion and you put it in the bank and you get 5% interest, you're going to be getting $130,000 a day to spend. And you can try and spend $130,000 a day every day for the year. That's just to keep the principal balance flat, right? You can try to spend $130,000 a year, but it's really hard. I've tried, $130,000 a day. I've tried to do this, and I always end up with a few pennies left at the end of the day. And so rich people, they can't spend the money fast enough, so they save it. They put it into investments. And here's the critical thing. And this is the thing the Germans don't understand, and this is the thing that I think the average person doesn't really get. When rich people save, there's no immaculate saving. Assets held by the rich, meaning all that stuff they're getting above, right, the rise of average wages, assets held by the rich always have a corresponding liability somewhere else. Someone has to be accumulating debt for rich people to have assets. Someone has to be accumulating debt over here on the other side of the balance sheet for rich people to have assets. And to get to the end of the story, the only way for those assets to actually have meaning in a financial sense is if the debtors have enough income to make payments on their liabilities. Okay? But if you're over here thinking these assets are somehow disconnected from the debtors, you could fool yourself into thinking that you can crush their income and still have your assets. But let's just back up. Here's the 1% accumulating assets. What are they accumulated as? They accumulated as claims on the housing system in the US primarily. And that's mortgage debt over here for debtors. Okay, so here's American debt, the other side of this. And here's why we get into trouble. So here's American debt. This is debt to income ratios for US households. And you can see 4 phases here. The first phase is right here. This is the 1950s and 60s. This is America becoming a homeowner society. It's the first big bump up in mortgage debt. This is my parents, your grandparents buying houses as we go from 35% homeownership to homeownership rates in the low 60%. Once they've bought their houses, debt basically flattens out. And I talk about this in terms of houses and not other things because mortgage debt is the big part of private debt for households. You guys worry about student debt, it's because you don't have houses. Your parents might talk about their car payments, but behind that is the housing debt. And pretty much in any given year you want to pick, housing debt is between 80 and 90% of household debt. Okay, so this is why this is about houses. So everybody buys their house, they buy their first house, debt is flatlined. And then people like me enter the housing market and we want nicer and better housing. We go into debt to do that. And then we have the real bubble and the real buildup of housing debt in the 2000s when housing prices get way out of line, way out of line. And why does this matter? This matters because the way the American economy grew in the 1990s was the translation of falling interest rates into increased consumption power, and it's driven by the housing market. Now, you don't have to take notes on this. Listen to my words. You don't have to take notes because the slides are all going to go up on SlideShare, so don't be busy copying this, okay? But what you're going to see here is 4 slides with sets of flows, but pay attention to the words. So here's what's going on in the US economy in the 1990s, 2000s. We have disinflation. Disinflation is not deflation. Disinflation is a slowing of the rate of inflation. We have disinflation. Because we have disinflation, nominal interest rates fall. Nominal interest rates, not real interest rates. But you know what? Nominal interest rates matter, even though, again, the economic textbooks talk mostly about real interest rates. Why do they matter? They matter because institutional structures in the housing finance system can translate falling nominal interest rates into increased purchasing power. Why? In America, we have this great system. It favors debtors. The one place where it favors debtors is the housing finance system. In America, you have an unlimited right to walk into the bank and say, hey, that mortgage I took out on my first $1 million house in 1989 when I moved down to Charlottesville and take a job at the University of Virginia at 11% interest rate, that $1 million mortgage at 11% where I was paying $110,000 of interest a year, I want to refinance it because interest rates have come down to 8% or 7% or 6%. And when I refinance it, my interest rate bill goes from being $110,000 a year, let's say, down to maybe $50,000 or $60,000 a year, and all of a sudden I have a lot of extra purchasing power. Because remember, I was able to afford the $110,000 of interest a year in my first house, my first mortgage. So I have the cash, I have the income to sustain it, and as I refinance, that cash is freed up and I can spend it on other things. Now if you subtract a 0 from that, you'll get the real numbers from me. My first house had an 11% mortgage. By 2000, it was down to 5%. And here's where I'm different from most Americans. I just simply use that extra cash to pay the mortgage off faster. But what the average American did was spend money. They did more consumption. They put the granite counters in. They went out and bought the matched set of stuff for the bathroom from Bed Bath & Beyond. They bought a BMW. And what that did was create growth in the US, growth in Asia, growth in Germany. So people spent more money, more consumption. When they spent that money, they were hiring people to put in the granite countertops, to sell them the car. So you have faster growth in the US. Because we have faster growth, a lot of that stuff is being sourced from overseas. So we have trade deficits. That's what's driving German growth, Japanese growth, Chinese growth. And then here's the thing that also matters, really important, not predicted by the standard economic models. Usually, if you have this, big trade deficits, the dollar of the value should fall sharply against the value of the currency that the exporters have. That's how you get equilibration. But we don't get that. What we get instead is primarily Asians, but also to a certain extent the Germans, recycling their trade surpluses to the US as purchases of treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. And when they buy treasury bonds, right, the demand for treasury bonds is higher than it would normally be relative to the supply, and so the price of treasury bonds falls in interest rate terms. So interest rates on treasury bonds are depressed by 100 basis points, 1 percentage point, just by the recycling of Asian money in the 1995 to 2005 period. And you might say 1 percentage point, it's not a lot, but what you have to think is treasury bond, 10-year treasury bond, that's what sets the interest rate for mortgages. And a fall of interest rates on mortgages from 7% to 6% or 8% to 7%, that's significant. That motivates people to refinance their mortgage. So this recycling, both directly and indirectly, again, reinforces that flow of cash through the housing finance system. And then secondarily, because it's not just a story about houses, more consumption, more growth means more tax revenue. And in the Clinton era, don't worry about why this is so, that means the Fed lowers interest rates even faster. So this is the American growth model in the 90s and the 2000s. And the critical things that connect to the eurocrisis are these things. We run a trade deficit, it drives growth in Germany. There's recycling, which continues to drive growth in the US. And that links up to China, which has a model that looks something like this and connects to the US. And this is a model in which there's financial repression. People don't have the ability to save where they want to save. They put their money into state banks. The state banks loan the money at low interest rates to their friends. I mean, that's party elites, right, to their friends. And this investment goes into exports to the US. And then the central bank buys up the dollars that are coming in from the trade surplus, and they sterilize that. by issuing renminbi bonds. And to make that work for the central bank, they have to keep interest rates low, which means that people save more money. Okay? So you get a cycle in China that's critically dependent on these two things, keeping interest rates low in China, which means people have to put their money in the bank, which drives more and more investment for export production, and then to keep the growth going, undervaluation of the yuan, renminbi, and that links up to the US economy through these two shaded boxes here. And then secondarily, reinforcing the export orientation of the economy. If you're trying to save money for your health care because there's no welfare state, or for your kids' education because there's no welfare state in China, or for your pension because there's basically no welfare state, and interest rates are low, you've got to save a lot of money, and because you're saving a lot of money, you're not consuming. So even though consumption rises in China, absolutely, relative to the growth you have in China, it's not rising rapidly, and the consumption share of GDP falls continuously in China over the last 15 years. So where does all the production go? It goes into exports, which means it comes here. Okay, so they're exporting. Now we're finally in Europe. Here's the German version of this. The Germans look at the world in the 1990s and they say we have a problem. And again, if you only read the newspapers, you never get this. The newspapers are full of, and I often get questions about, but Germany has low unemployment now and high growth and it's doing great. In the 1990s, not so. In the 1990s, Germany had fiscal deficits, budget deficits, high unemployment. So they wanted to solve their problem. How do they solve their problem? By the way, which sounds a lot like Greece, Spain. They solve their problem by making a deal, and the deal is to restrain wages. Unions go to employers, employers go to the unions. The deal is the unions say, we'll hold down the growth of wages in order to sustain employment and get more jobs. Because we know that if we hold down wages, we'll have more exports. More exports will mean more profits. More profits mean you can invest. When you invest, we'll get more jobs. And the businesses say, sure, no problem. We'll invest if you hold down wages and we get more exports. So you have wage restraint. And what wage restraint does in Germany is mean domestic demand is lower. If people's wages aren't growing, they're going to spend less. And actually also there's a welfare state story here too, which is that in the 90s and especially in the 2000s, there's a lot of efforts to change the nature of the German welfare state that make people feel insecure. And so they also start saving more, and again, you have low domestic demand. But the basic story is low domestic demand, less consumption, slower economic growth in Germany as compared to, let's say, the US. And here's where things become problematic. Unions are restraining wages, domestic demand is low, the economy is growing more slowly. German firms look at the world and they say, right, we have to invest, we're getting more exports, that wage restraint thing is working, we're getting more exports, but where are we going to invest? Why would we invest in Germany? Wages are too high here, the economy is growing too slowly, growing more slowly than in the US or China. Let's invest where the growth is. That's the rational thing to do. So the German firms and also the German financial system will begin investing in the US rather than Germany. They invest in China rather than Germany because it's growing fast. So you have less domestic investment. Less domestic investment means less employment. Less employment means unions continue to have wage restraint imposed on them now because there's still too many unemployed people. And then you also have a fiscal version of this, which is what's going to drive the welfare reform efforts or reorganization efforts. But it's the reverse of the US one. Lower tax revenues, tight money policy, and so even more pressure on unions to have wage restraint. So this is a model in which you've got slow domestic growth, but continued increases in productivity. So again, like the Chinese, where's that stuff going to go? It's going to go somewhere else. And somewhere else is the US and Southern Europe. And I have to just advance my slides so I know where I'm going, because this is impossible to keep in my head. Okay. So here's where Germany, Japan, unfortunately, I don't have data for China, end up. 1995 to 2009, what share of GDP growth is attributable to net exports, to the export surpluses? Well, Germany, Japan, 20 to 27% of growth over that period is from net exports. Domestic growth is slow. They grow because they export. And in this period, this looks like, when you look at this, you might think, boy, here's the losers. US, UK, France, right? Importers, here's the winners, right? This is where you would expect, wow, lots of robust export performance. But when you actually look at GDP growth, here's the winners and here's the losers. These guys are growing slowly. These people are growing fast, okay? And that's because what's happening is this. Here's the German model. We're growing slowly. What do we do with our export surpluses? We're not going to invest them at home. So where do we go with them? Well, we buy US mortgage bonds, which is why Deutsche Bank was for a while the largest holder of foreclosed properties in places like Cleveland, which you wouldn't expect. Oh, and we lend it to the states in the south of Europe, okay? So we lend them money. And when that money flows in, what you get is a couple things happening. The first is really robust growth in the south. And because there's really robust growth in the south, in a way, not surprisingly, Germany ends up having a bigger trade surplus with Europe than it does with the rest of the world, right? We see the BMWs here, but in the south, what you see is a lot of capital investment, a lot of road building, a lot of BMWs. And so the trade surplus with the south is huge up until the crisis. And then, of course, it starts to drop off. What else do we see? Well, we see the effects of wage restraint, which are what make that export surplus possible. Here's relative unit labor costs. So as you know, right, a really high productivity individual like me can be paid 3 times what a graduate student is paid. And it makes sense because I can produce 3 times as much as a graduate student does in an hour because I read a lot of fairy tales. So I have a structure for my work. And in that situation, you would have to hire 3 graduate students to do my output, and so it ends up being the same cost. So it's not absolute labor cost that matters, but relative. Relative here meaning adjusted for productivity differences. So here's relative unit labor costs for Europe, and the black line here is Germany, and you see the effect of wage restraint. Relative unit labor costs fall, which is why they can export to these other places where relative unit labor costs are rising, right, quite rapidly, again, up until the crisis. And because Germany is making more and more stuff, but wages are stagnant, they're not buying it, where does the stuff go? It goes to the south. This is the physical manifestation of the relative unit labor cost thing. This is the physical counterpart of the trade deficit slide. So what you have here is consumption levels, consumption growth in Germany reset each year to be the basis for the index. So Germany is the 100 line. German consumption is actually rising a little bit. But what happens in all the other countries is what's happening to consumption relative to German consumption? Rising even more rapidly. That's the consumption of imports from Germany. And then again, we might say, well, the Germans are exporting all this stuff. Surely they're winners. But here's the data that corresponds to the other slide I showed you, but now with Europe. So here's Germany with extremely slow GDP growth. And here's the losers who are consuming a lot, growing a lot on the basis of borrowed money from the Germans. And that works really well. It's great for a long time until the wolf comes. And here's why it's great. So here's what's driving this if we just look at interest rates. Here's the years up to the introduction of the euro. We see huge differences in interest rates on public debt until the euro is introduced. Then it converges. And this is a happy story. It's a happy story, which is a story that runs like this. Germany does wage restraint. It exports capital. When it exports capital to the south, even if we just forget about the effects of removing devaluation risk by introducing the euro, when it exports capital to the south, what happens? Money flows into Spain or Greece or Portugal. Interest rates go down a little bit. Because they've gone down a little bit, there's more economic activity. Because there's more economic activity, tax revenues go up. Because tax revenues go up, the fiscal situation looks better. because the fiscal situation looks better, a banker sitting in the big glass tower in Frankfurt says, looking at the Bloomberg terminal, says, oh, look, more people are employed in Spain, the government's got more revenues, we can lend them more money, it's safe, things are getting better. And when they do that, rinse and repeat, the same cycle occurs. So you rinse and repeat this over a period of a decade, and a ton of money can come in because every time the bankers do their Bayesian updating, it's like, oh, things are still getting better, no problems. Except, of course, the wolf is going to come, and then we're going to see some problems. Okay? So why does the wolf come? Here's where the wolf comes. So this is 3 slides. One is internal imbalances in the EU, one is external, and then I have the US external position. So here's what the world looks like if you're standing inside Europe. A few countries are missing, but they don't really change this picture much. What you see are huge trade surplus inside Europe for the Dutch. They're very, very productive. It must be the cheese. You see huge trade surpluses for the Germans, which we've explained. They keep getting bigger and bigger, and that's because of wage restraint. And then, of course, the corresponding deficits over here because assets, liabilities, exports, imports, right? They match. And so here's the rinse and repeat cycle, making bigger and bigger imbalances up until the crisis. And here's the external trade balance. Now we see something which we didn't realize before, which is Holland is basically a giant railroad station. The cheese doesn't help. They're basically importing stuff that they then re-export to the rest of Europe. And so the only true trade surplus country in Europe is the Germans. Everybody else has deficits. How do you pay for the deficits? Well, you could pay for the deficits if you had surpluses with the US. You could pay for the deficits by borrowing money. Mostly they're borrowing money. And when the US crisis happens, if we just think about trade deficits, what happens is a big problem. So here's this little bit of purple down here. This is European Union ex-Germany, surpluses with the US, right? So US deficits means surpluses. And they keep getting bigger and bigger too as the US housing boom takes off in the 2000s. And that helps them deal with their trade imbalance with Northern Europe. When the crisis hits, Americans suddenly stop buying BMWs, they stop buying olive oil, they stop taking vacations in Tuscany, and suddenly the European Union net of Germany is running deficits with the US, and it's also running deficits with the Germans and the Dutch, and it's also actually not getting capital inflows anymore, and that's the wolf arriving. Okay, so now we're here, right? This is Lehman. All of a sudden Lehman happens, and the American housing market collapses, and it brings down American consumption, and it also brings down European banks. European banks loaned a lot of money to the American housing market, and because they were systematically dumber than the American bankers, and by dumber I mean not as criminal, they really got the bad end of this. And so a whole bunch of them go bankrupt. Dexia, Fortis, ABN AMRO, inside the British market, Royal Bank of Scotland, and of course famously Northern Rock. But also German banks. Hypoverein goes bankrupt. Saxon Bank goes bankrupt. They're bailed out by the German state. But because they go bankrupt, when banks go bankrupt, they can't lend. When banks lose lots of money, they have to make those losses good from their capital. When they make those losses good from their capital, they have to pull in loans so they can replenish their capital. And so what this shows you here is not just the banks going bankrupt, but also saying, hey, we don't have any more money to lend. Where are we going to put our remaining loans? Who are we going to ration loans? Well, who are we going to cut off from loans when we have to ration loans? Well, if you're German banks, you're not going to cut off your industrial customers, but you will stop lending to the South. And in the South, where you have the same kind of housing bust, and the government is bailing out banks by taking on their private debt as public debt, suddenly the numbers look bad. If you're sitting in a big glass tower in Frankfurt looking at the Bloomberg feed, and you only have a 30-minute attention span. You start looking at the numbers from Spain, and it's, oh, unemployment is rising. Because unemployment is rising, people's incomes are falling. Because people's incomes are falling, tax revenue is shrinking. Because tax revenue is shrinking, the government is in a deficit that's made worse by the fact that social spending is getting higher. And all of a sudden, interest rates are also rising because now there's a perception of risk. And you start saying, wait, maybe we should lend less or call our loans in. And when you start doing that, what you do is create the reverse cycle. Every time you call loans in, more people are out of work, tax revenues fall more, social spending goes up, interest rates go up. So it's rinse and repeat like this, instead of rinse and repeat with convergence. Okay? So you have a crisis. And the crisis is understood popularly as a crisis of public debt, even though it's first and foremost a crisis of private debt. It's a crisis of Deutsche Bank lending too much money into the housing market, private decisions. It's a crisis of Spanish banks lending too much to Spanish home buyers. It's a crisis of Irish banks lending too much to real estate speculation in Ireland, private decisions. But for political purposes, it's relabeled as a public crisis because all those private debts are taken into taken onto the state, because to make something that's a little bit complicated really simple, at the end of the day, when we net out all the assets and liabilities on everybody's balance sheet, where you end up is, here's the state with the ability to create assets because it has taxation power, and here's households that are subject to taxation and therefore have a big potential liability on their books. And so all those private debts end up on the state's balance sheet as public debt, and it looks like a public debt crisis. And so the usual suspects come out and say, this is a problem of the welfare state being too big. It's created fiscal deficits. And so we have to rein in all this spending so that we can get back on a sound fiscal basis. Except that's not really what happened, right? It was the bailing out of the banks. So just 2 slides on the myth before we get to the bailout. Here's Germany, fiscal deficit. Here's the really big welfare states inside the EU, Sweden and Denmark. And you can see these irresponsible social democrats. Who knows how they did it? Maybe they're lucky. Maybe it's the marzipan, but they're actually better fiscal situation than the Germans, and actually quite substantial surpluses coming into the crisis. Quite substantial because, in fact, they also were having export booms, and the government accumulated part of that. So you might say, okay, that's the John Stevens story. We know these are great countries. What about the South? Really, they're losers, right? It's that those lazy Greeks and those Spanish folks. It's all tapas and good times. You don't actually see that either to a certain extent. So here again, the black line, that's Germany, fiscal deficit. Ireland, Spain, actually small surpluses and certainly a better fiscal situation than the Germans. The Greeks, yeah, okay, they really are. They do have problems. That story is right. But up until the crisis, these fiscal situations for the pigs, except for Greece, not really substantially different from Germany. So if they were being profligate, the Germans were also being profligate. So it just doesn't hold up. It's the transformation of private debt into public debt that creates the crisis. And again, in the US, we had exactly the same thing, but it doesn't create regional imbalances. When we in Virginia, who didn't really have as much of a bubble, bail out Florida, Arizona, California, it just happens. We don't know it. We don't notice. But when the Germans or the Dutch or the Finns are asked to bail out the Greeks and the Spanish, they think of it in terms of, hey, you're going to take my money and give it to those people down there because, and the myth matters, because their welfare state is too extravagant, or whatever the version of the myth is. Okay. But in fact, what was happening was this bailout of private into public debt. So here's the story here. And so what happened was you had a huge increase over time of financial debt, not sovereign debt. The bump up in sovereign debt is actually relatively small, and it happens after the crisis. This is pretty stable in terms of flows. And the the real problem was this fear of banks going bankrupt and the need to have the public bailout. And so you get a public bailout. And the bailout was of these banks in Spain, Portugal, et cetera. And it was because it wasn't just Spanish banks, but again, it's the German banks and the Dutch banks that were lending money more to the public sector, but also to the private sector, and quite substantial amounts of money. And remember, these banks are banks that have already taken a hit from the US crisis, and now they have a second hit from the internal crisis, Spain, Portugal, Greece. And so what you get is a publicly orchestrated bailout of those banks. And that's what you see here. So this, unfortunately, is not my slide, so no nice colors to make it easy to see. But I'll walk you through it. The dark bars are private capital inflows or outflows. This is a little deceptive, but private capital flows. The light bar is official capital flows. And here's the story of the boom. More and more private capital inflows into Southern Europe as the Germans, the Dutch, et cetera, recycle their trade surpluses. Then the American crisis happens, and here you have in 07, 08, the US Fed bailing out the world, and in Europe that turns into public bailouts of the banks, but the banks are still lending. It looks like there's stabilization in 08, and then the bankers in Frankfurt wake up and say, wait, actually the numbers are not so good for Spain, Portugal, Greece, and they say, we want to get our money out, which is what you see here, 10, 11, and then, that's the European Central Bank orchestrating the bailout of the private bankers. So there's the first crisis, there's the pause where they say maybe we've got things in hand, and then here's the public bailout. And here's some numbers on that. Current here means end of 2011. So, because I stole this from the Bank for International Settlements. So this is Euro area exposure, banking exposures to the PIGS as of December 09. You see most of it is borrowing from private banks. There's this little bit of bailout that's already happened from the ECB. And then 09, over the next 2 years, what do we have? We have the private banks share shrinking. And these are actual euros, not percentage, shrinking. Borrowing from the ECB rising. The emergency funds also suddenly come into play. That's the public bailout of the private banks. But because we know that it's actually, we know, right? This is what we read in the newspaper every day. We know that it's a story of irresponsible politicians creating huge fiscal deficits and not irresponsible bankers and bad policy choices by unions and firms in Germany and bad policy choices by regulators in the US. Because we know it's a problem of bad choices around the welfare state, what you end up with is this as the typical policy response after you have the bailout of the banks, and that policy response makes things worse. So this is really recent, April 2013. If you go back to the talk I did on this a year ago, you'd find quotes from 2012. If you go back to the talk I did on this in 2011, you'll find quotes from 2011. The quotes don't really change that much, but I'm not going to bore you with them. But this is the German finance minister about 6 months ago or 4 months ago saying, hey, things are okay. We have the right policy here. Our policy is to make the countries in the South cut back on spending and get their fiscal balance in order, because that will solve the, he doesn't say the words balance of payments problem that we have. He says solve the crisis. But it's basically a balance of payments crisis. And they think about it that way a little bit, because if you cut spending, yeah, you'll import less. But you import less because your economy is contracting. And if your economy is contracting, that doesn't solve the fiscal problem. And moreover, if you're sitting in Germany and you're trying to export to Southern Europe, in the long run, it doesn't make your situation better either. So although the German economy has been growing, it's been growing because there's been an enormous fiscal stimulus in China over the same period. But in the South, meanwhile, German exports, if you remember that slide from a while back, have been shrinking. So you get this austerity policy that basically makes the problem worse. And he says this in April 2013. And the contemporaneous, meaning if the backward-looking data, when he said it in 2013, were from the third quarter of 2012. And so he doesn't really quite know what's going on at the time he says it, but in 2012, GDP growth, negative 0.6%. In 2013, the forecast is negative 0.4%. Unemployment in the second quarter of 2013, 12.1%. At the time he was saying it, it was 12%. And actually, what I think is the most important measure is not how many people are unemployed, but actually how many people are working. You could have a high unemployment rate and still have growth in jobs, which is a good thing. Total employment in Eurozone today is at the same level it was in the second quarter of 2005. So you have basically 8 years of standing still in terms of job growth. Now, in the context of a country like Germany where the population is shrinking, you might say that's actually good, but Europe-wide, populations are not shrinking. So this is really bad. Okay. So the policies are making the crisis worse. Okay. So the summary here is very simple. The Eurozone crisis is a function of having built straw house. They create a common currency for an economic zone that is not an optimal currency area, so it's inherently weak. It works for a while because the regional imbalances are not that big. When the American housing boom starts, those regional imbalances get magnified. When the Germans begin recycling their trade surpluses, the trade surpluses that emerge because of their policy choice to have wage restraint, when they begin recycling those trade surpluses to the South, they create a European version of the American housing boom in the South. And that lasts only as long as the money keeps rolling. And when, as inevitably happens, 1 or 2 or 3, or it becomes 100 or 200 or 300 banks go bankrupt, the whole thing comes crashing down. And in Europe, it comes crashing down in a way that looks like a public debt crisis, but you should understand this as the second or third ripple from the initial American housing market crisis. So, you can have in your head that image of the drop of water falling into the still lake, and you see concentric rings coming out. So the drop of water here, if I change the metaphor a little, the drop of water is the crash of Lehman, and it's the crash of the American housing bubble. And the first crisis is, of course, the American housing market crisis, housing finance market crisis. And the second one is the invisible crisis of the European banks, which are exposed to the American housing market, which creates the third ripple, which is the pullback of lending to the public sector in the South, which gives you the Eurozone crisis. Okay? But it's important to keep in mind those first ripples. This is not just a crisis of, too much spending in the South on welfare state. It's a balance of payments crisis. It's a balance of payments crisis triggered by the American housing finance market crisis. Okay, so questions, and I believe you're supposed to talk into the mic. A lot of stuff here.
Jacob. Well, I guess I have a question, which is, given that the European Union is not, in the opinion of many economists, an optimal currency union, what's the likelihood that they will take steps towards some sort of institutionalized fiscal policy, a federal fiscal policy? And if that doesn't happen, what are the long-term prospects? What's the durability of this currency union, this straw house?
Yeah. So that's the question I always get asked, and I always am like, I don't want to make predictions about Europe. But I think the modal probability is they will stumble forward, optimistically stumble forward the way Benjamin Cohen thinks they'll stumble forward, which is his understanding of optimism is maybe they'll get 1 or 2% GDP growth. It's a little bit close to what Schaubler is saying. I'm somewhat more pessimistic, and I think they will actually continue to have shrinking economies. And that makes me somewhat pessimistic about the stability of the euro. And I don't think that the euro will disappear. And in that respect, I'm in agreement with Benjamin Cohen on this. But I do think that you'll have a rinse and repeat on the austerity policies unless Merkel uses the recent election as a window for having a cautious reflation. Because as I think about this, there's only two ways out of the crisis. Once you stop doing sort of emergency lending the way the ECB has been doing emergency lending, there's only two ways out of the crisis. And the two ways out of the crisis stem from the fact that the money is already lost. The banks don't want to believe that because it'll cause them to go bankrupt. The money's already lost. And the question is therefore not, can you prevent the money from being lost? The question is, how do you manifest the losses? And there's two choices for manifesting losses. You can either have inflation, which implicitly devalues the debts because the nominal value of debt stays the same, even though you have inflation reducing its real value. Or you have deflation, in which you have bankruptcy and the debts disappear. We know historically what happens when you pick the deflation route. That's the 1930s. If you say to people, hey, if you, the asset holder, say to the debtor, hey, you've got to pay me back. Cut your spending on everything else so you can pay me back. I have a claim on you. I want you to make good on it. That's basically what the Germans and the Dutch, et cetera, are saying to the Greeks and the Spaniards. Okay, well, I already told you this, right? If you're over here and you're a debtor, the way that you make payments on debts is out of income. The only way the asset holder gets the money is because you have income to pay them. And if what you're doing in terms of policy makes income over here shrink, it makes it a lot harder to pay that money back. And again, we saw what happened in the 1930s with that. That's the collapse of the American housing market, the American farm mortgage market. It's the collapse of the American economy. And so the bad scenario from deflation is really pretty bad. I don't think anybody wants to go to the 1930s. On the inflation scenario, the banks will lose money. The asset holders will lose money. The people who have assets, that's by the way me, right, as a really old person with a pension plan, will lose money. You'll lose money because of inflation, but you won't lose your principal as much, and certainly the social consequences as compared to deflation are not as bad. So the optimal policy from my point of view, yeah, would be something like a fiscal union, politically completely impossible. Eurobonds, a little bit more politically possible, but I think pretty much politically impossible. The only way to actually get something that's politically possible is to say to the Dutch, the Finns, the Germans, oh, we're going to give you something to help out the euro. We're going to give you something. Here's a voucher, 1,000 euros per person in your household. But the voucher can only be redeemed in Mallorca, at Athens airport, right? And people will, and what are they doing there? Well, that's an inflationary solution. People will live with that because they think they're getting something. It's money illusion, but they'll accept it because they're getting something. That's one way to do it. I mean, you need to have this kind of huge transfer of funds so that down here in Spain and Greece, there's money in people's hands so that they'll actually have growth again, so that, I said this so many times, tax revenues go up, interest rates come down, it looks good, that's how you do it. And we know that, that's Keynes, that's old story, okay? So I'm pessimistic about Europe because I think actually the most you could get is something like that. I don't see fiscal union or Eurobonds as plausible outcomes. But of course I'm saying that a week after Merkel won this relatively large victory, and so all bets are off. So I could be completely wrong. She might walk out on stage. We have decided to help our friends in the South. We know they really are hardworking and they can be good European citizens, so we give them more money. Could be, but I'm not counting on it. Okay, there was a second question.
Well, first of all, I can assure you that most Germans don't wake up in the morning and think that Greeks are lazy and don't work, first of all. Second of all, my question is, you explained that the wage restraint is the main reason for the trade imbalance in Europe. And so one way of telling the story is that in fact Germany could not buy Greek products because of low domestic demand, because of wage restraint. But the other way of telling the story is, well, BMWs, Mercedes, Volkswagen are not primarily sold in the world because of low wages, but because it's actually products which are needed in the world. It's high-end technology, it's high-end products, And in Greece, there is no biggest chemical company in the world. There are no many family-owned small companies. There is no real industry. Germany is not relying, like Ireland, 5 times, the financial market has 5 times the size of the economy. We are not relying on the city of London exclusively. So the question is whether, coming back to your graduate students example, whether this can be true for Germany and Greece, for example, because it might be about structural things. In Germany, is not based on systematic corruption and on patronage in the economy, but on efficient systems. So the question is whether the wage restraint is the only possible way of blaming the Germans for causing all this trade imbalance, or whether other countries just have a great lack of systemic reforms.
Yeah. Okay, so I emphasize Germany in the context of the Euro story, because the natural temptation is to say this is exclusively a problem created by the importing countries or by the debtors. And again, that is this theory that assets and trade surpluses are somehow immaculate. It is, as a matter of accounting convention, and it also, as a matter of accounting convention, and as a matter of financial flows and the corresponding material flows, impossible to have trade surpluses without trade deficits, and to have assets without liabilities. So the counterfactual here is not a counterfactual in which Germany has trade surpluses and a more responsible South has balanced trade, right? If you had a more responsible South, or if you had a South with balanced trade, it would imply balanced trade for Germany, no surpluses. So the reason to stress Germany is to go back and ask the question, where does this imbalance in trade come from? Where does this imbalance in trade come from? And it takes 2 sides to make that imbalance of trade, a surplus country and a deficit country. So it's not to say the Germans are exclusively and only the ones at fault. This is a symbiotic relationship, or whatever the inverse, the negative version of a symbiotic relationship would be. It doesn't actually help both sides. That's number one. And then number 2 is, we tell this as a story of countries precisely because the European Union and the Eurozone aren't really unified. That's the political straw-housedness of the missing optimum currency area. And that's why I give you the example. I give you a better example when we say we don't get up and say, is anybody from Alabama here? Okay, we don't get up and say, Alabama, one of the most corrupt states in America. There's really, despite the fact that there's a Mercedes factory there, really there's not much that's actually produced in Alabama of any use. Or you could pick whatever state you wanted or whatever region you wanted. I mean, I could tell the same story for southwestern Virginia, right? And there are Greece. But why don't we have the same problem? Well, because if you're living in Alabama and you're retired and you have low income, you're getting a Social Security check, which is pegged at the median for the US, which means there's a huge transfer of income to you in real terms. And you spend that money. And it helps their local economy. And it's what enables the Alabama government to tax you as a low-income earner, because they don't tax their high-income earners, to generate the subsidies to bring Mercedes in. So we don't tell it as a story of states. We just say, oh, there's a housing market problem in the US, or there's a housing collapse, or there's a banking collapse. So it comes out as a story about Germany because it's not actually an integrated political entity. And so choices made in Germany matter in a way that we don't think about how choices made in California matter. California has huge trade surplus with the rest of the US. Huge trade surplus with the rest of the US. It gets recycled to the rest of the US through the tax system. That doesn't happen in Europe. But if California were its own country, then we'd have actually problems somewhat similar, where California taxpayers would be saying, wait, why are we subsidizing all those people in Alabama who don't buy that many iPhones anyway, and if they did, they wouldn't know how to use them? I mean, you'd get that kind of rhetoric, right? I'm not endorsing that rhetoric, but I say you'd get that kind of rhetoric, and then you'd have political problems, okay? Can you pass the mic, please?
You stressed the interdependence between the US and China. How do you think this will be an important question in the years ahead? If there's a new crisis coming up, how do you think China will influence this kind of outcome?
Yeah, that's an hour-long answer. Three things, and hopefully brief. Number one is, again, contrary to the conventional wisdom, the problem is a Chinese problem, not a US problem. And that's partly because of political power. So when you're the trade deficit country and you have control of your own currency, and it also helps to be a big market, the way the US is a big market, if the creditor country, the Chinese are a creditor country, if the surplus country says to you, you need to live within your means, and if you don't make reforms, we're not going to export more to you, and we're not going to loan you money to buy those exports. What you're really hearing is the creditor country saying, please pay us back, because the power is really on your side. It's the debtor country that has the power, if it has its own currency. Because if the Chinese say to the US, we're not buying any more treasury bonds, we're not buying any more mortgage-backed securities. In other words, we're not going to recycle our trade surpluses with you anymore. What does that mean for the US economy? Oh, it means a smaller trade deficit with China, which means that at the margin, either we buy more imports from countries that also buy more that import from us. We buy from Mexico instead of from China, which means more economic activity in the US, or we get direct production in the US again. And you're actually seeing that happen very slow motion. Simple, stupid things. Hula hoops used to be made in the US. They were offshored to China. They're being made in the US again. Well, that's the US trade deficit shrinking. I could show you slides, but I'd have to flip through. So the problem is actually a problem of China. Can China manage its economic slowdown without having political chaos? So that's then the second thing. What the US is worried about is political chaos in China. You don't want any abrupt change in flows, because it's bad for everybody, even though it's less bad for the US. And the third thing is political. You don't want a collapse in China, because there are actually a fair number of outstanding geopolitical issues that people might start shooting over if they lose control over their own population. So again, I don't know what you know, but if you know about disputes over the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea, or over the Senkaku Islands between China and Japan, these are places where the next world war could conceivably start if people go a little crazy. So that would be the worry. But we're not really quite there yet, because so far it's being managed pretty well. And it's being managed pretty well because I think on both sides there's a real clear sense of what could go wrong. Okay. Okay. Thank you. It's hard to stay awake in a dark room, so you did well. I feel good.